Um, the title of my talk this evening is Poverty, Service Delivery, and Development. And I feel really privileged to be here to be able to share a little bit of my experience working in developing countries and where some of my thoughts are now. I hope just to be able to throw some things out there to you and hopefully have a dialogue today, get some feedback on where my thinking is. It's also a timely topic to be talking about these issues now, given the unimaginable tragedy that's happened in Haiti. I worked for Catholic Relief Services, and I had the privilege to travel to Haiti many years ago and to see, even though it was chaotic, but the vibrancy of the city. And it's, of course, it's heartbreaking to see what's happening, but it also illustrates how social inequality can exacerbate hazards. So I had the opportunity to recently write a blog post for a special issue of the Kirwan Institute's blog called Race Talk. It's an exciting new blog that provides a forum to talk about issues of social justice. And what I focused on in that blog post was, okay, a natural disaster, the impact of a natural disaster is shaped by the magnitude of the disaster, but it's also shaped by the realities on the ground that are shaped by social inequality. And so because of that fact, most of the victims of natural disasters around the world are in developing countries. And within those developing countries, the poorest of the poor are hardest hit. Even natural disasters notwithstanding, on a daily basis, people are struggling to survive when they don't have access to things like clean water, which is what I look at, adequate sanitation, sufficient health care. A lot of unavoidable deaths occur all around the world. And so when I talk to classes that I've taught to before about these issues, the immediate response is, oh, it's because they're poor. It's poverty. We just have to lift them out of poverty and things will be better. Or corruption. That's always a knee-jerk reaction, especially when I tell people I do work in Nigeria. Corruption. Hopefully by the end of the talk today, I'll have you thinking about more than it's just poverty or it's just corruption. Those of you who've worked in these settings know how complex the realities are on the ground. And my work for the dissertation was about understanding behavior from the perspective of citizens, communities on the ground. Why do people do what they do? When we look at the growth of slums in cities, as the speaker said, people are coming to the cities for opportunity. There's a reason. People are rational. People do things because it makes sense for their lives. When it comes to providing access to water, we see things in the developing literature, such as there may be a piped water supply in the city, but people may opt not to connect to that supply and to purchase water from vendors. There's reasons why they do that, and my research, some of the reasons why that happens came out. But before I get into talking about my research, I wanted to enter the conversation by talking about how I got into international development. Many of you here are at the point in your lives where you're trying to figure out what you want to do with your life or what you want to do at this stage of your life. So I thought it would be perhaps useful to share how I got to this point as an entry point to this conversation. Now, I also want to preface talking about development. So it looked like a line, but underneath that line, development, you see a lot of acronyms there. GNI, GDP, HDI. Some of you will be familiar with these. Gross national income, gross domestic product, Millennium Development Goals, World Development Indicators, all kinds of ways to measure what is essentially about improving people's quality of life. We'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. But for now, My first experience abroad was in Zimbabwe. I did a study abroad as a junior, got the opportunity to spend a year in Zimbabwe. Take you a little bit into Southern Africa. Got the chance to spend a year there. It was before the current economic crisis. In fact, it was at a time when the current breakdown of the economy, something like that occurring was unimaginable. Something had happened like that in neighboring Zambia, hyperinflation. At the time when I went in '94, Zimbabwe was still the economic breadbasket of Southern Africa. It exported food and agricultural products to the region. International companies like Guess were there with manufacturing operations, had a thriving tourist economy. In fact, people were upset that in 1980, when they had gained their independence from under the Ian Smith regime, who was the head of the minority white government after the British had left. When Zimbabwe had gained independence, the Zimbabwe dollar and the US dollar was 1-to-1. When I got there in '94, it was 8-to-1, and people felt like that was a catastrophe. Of course, it's like billions to one now. And the word on the street that everyone kept saying was ESAP. That's all everyone was talking about at the time, ESAP. I was like, what is this ESAP that everyone's talking about? Well, as you see here, ESAP stands for Economic Structural Adjustment Program. How many of you are familiar with the term structural adjustment? Have you heard that term before? Okay, it'll be an eye-opener then. Of course, on the street, I don't know if it zooms in. Oh, let me go back. All right. I'm on an adventure with all of you with this software tonight as well. So economic structural adjustment basically were policies put in place by the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, for companies that were experiencing economic shocks, especially companies that were coming out of heavily indebted due to excessive borrowing during the petrodollar boom during the 70s. There was a lot of currency floating around in the global markets. A lot of that money was in banks in the industrialized countries. The banks wanted to lend that money, and so credit terms were easy, and a lot of governments got heavily indebted. In fact, if you think about it, there's a lot of parallel to the current crisis that we're going through now when we think about the real estate market and what's been done. These things tend to be cyclical. So countries that got into trouble would adopt this austerity program, and in exchange for getting more aid in the form of loans, they had to do things which is, I wanted to zoom in on it, but basically they had to do things like deregulate their economy, privatize their economy, cut social spending, devalue their currency, focus on balancing budgets versus spending on social services, promote foreign direct investment, basically liberalize their economies in order to get more aid. Of course, the result of this was an upside-down world. In the book, How Third World Debt Harms Us All, Susan George said the world's poor are actually subsidizing the rich. And there was a big campaign among people in developing countries in Europe and the US called Jubilee, the Jubilee movement, which is about eliminating or canceling third world debt, because a lot of this debt falls under a legal principle called odious debt. It was either incurred during the colonial period, so a lot of, for example, most African countries became independent starting from 1950. If the colonial governments had debt, the new governments had to inherit that debt and had to pay their former colonial rulers back the interest. Apartheid era debt, the post-apartheid government paying debt. Dictator debt, so dictators that would borrow money and not spend it on the people or put the money in foreign bank accounts, countries still had to pay that. The petrodollars, that's money from the OPEC countries in the 70s would put the money that the foreign exchange that they got from selling oil, they would put it into banks in industrialized countries. And then outright embezzlement, all these forms of taking money out of developing countries and making countries more indebted, and the citizens would have to pay in the form of reduced spending on them, reduced social services, so that the government could get more money to essentially pay off the debt. It's a vicious circle. So that's what everybody was talking about as far as structural adjustment. So that was an eye-opener for a 19-year-old doing a study abroad program. And the first time traveling out of Los Angeles, first time traveling to another country. And I came back wanting to get involved in international development. So I took classes in international relations and economics, and applied and got into the public policy program at UCLA. Now, at the time, I was thinking, okay, it's all a top-down problem. If we just put in place the right policies, we can solve the problem. So my focus in the policy program was on science and technology policy and kind of macro-level economic development. And my thesis during the master's program was on export processing zones in Malawi. So I had the opportunity to go work for the State Department during the master's program and carry out research on democratic consolidation and export processing zones in Malawi. They were just coming out from under an era of dictatorship under Hastings Kamuzu Banda, and they were looking to jumpstart their economy by encouraging manufacturing foreign direct investment to come set up shop. The hope was that this would then lead to technology transfer and spur economic growth. The reality is, what I learned from that experience in Malawi is that I learned about the real fundamental challenges to development. When the building blocks of an economy are not in place, a country can become stuck, and it can be almost impossible to progress. What do I mean by that? When you walk through a textile factory, everything in the factory has to come from someplace, right? You got the machines need oil, the machines need thread, the boxes that the clothes go in, the dye on the boxes, the tape that seals the boxes, all of those things come from somewhere. Well, in Malawi's case, there are no industries to feed into that. So that means all of those things have to be imported from outside. The only way you can import those kind of things is with foreign exchange. And so you see the kind of catch-22. If you don't have the foreign exchange to import the hard inputs you need for manufacturing, then you get stuck. So what the reality of the export processing zone business was that it ended up being what they call cut-make-trim companies. So these were companies that would come up from South Africa and essentially finish half-finished goods, re-export them to South Africa to then be exported on to the United States and Europe and so forth. And very little technology transfer and those kind of things were actually going on. And like most countries that are desperate for foreign direct investment, the incentives for the companies were great for the companies, things like tax-free operation. And they also would set up the companies in these kind of industrial parks and try to guarantee electricity and things like that. But with no return, because the companies would get to operate in the country tax-free. Most of the times they're foreign. There were no requirements for the money they earned to be deposited in the country would be deposited abroad, and so forth. And most recently, the most recent thing I've read about the clothing industry in Malawi is that it's on the verge of collapse, not only because of the lack of inputs, but also the flood of secondhand clothing. And they're actually, ironically, under the Banda dictatorship, there was actually a strong domestic manufacturing sector, mostly because he channeled money and subsidized it and gained personally from it. But now that industry is collapsing. So, following that experience and finishing the master's degree, I decided that instead of going to work in Washington and kind of work at this kind of top level, I wanted to go to developing countries, work directly with communities on the ground. And so that's when I went with Catholic Relief Services, literally the day of graduation. Was on a plane headed to Baltimore for orientation, and then back to Zimbabwe actually, to work on projects we did projects on HIV/AIDS because the epidemic was exploding at that point in Zimbabwe, and also justice and peace programming. After working in Zimbabwe, I had the opportunity to manage our emergency programs in Angola during the outbreak of civil war. It was the first time I had seen war up close, riding on these tiny 9-seater UN planes that would get, some of them got shot down. We had to fly in these weird formations to avoid getting shot down. And you get a kind of, working in those situations, you get a kind of dark humor about it. Even though there's danger, but you don't think about it because you're thinking about what you're doing. But more than that, it was the first time I experienced living in a society where food was more important than cash. You could have money on the street, but money couldn't fill your stomach, right? There's no food. We lived on the coast, which had the most access to food because we were in Libido in the central towards the southern part of the country, and we were right on the port, and the ships would come in. So the markets would be empty until the ships would come in, and you knew that there would be food. And when the ships, after the ships would leave, you go to the market, and they'd all be full of like 2 products, like shelves and shelves of canned beans or something, just one thing. And so you could imagine if things were like that on the coast, what things were like in the interior. And providing assistance in that kind of setting was a challenge because when we would send convoys with food and stuff for internally displaced people that would come because their communities had been bombed by the rebel forces, and they would come to nearby towns, the convoys would get attacked because they had food on them. So these are the kind of things that we saw in country. The other thing that came out of that experience that left an impression is that it was the NGOs, although we were ostensibly working with the government to provide services to people, the reality was that the NGOs had the cars, the NGOs had the resources, and by NGOs I'm referring to non-governmental organizations, the kind of organizations that are actually providing assistance in Haiti right now. Are called NGOs. So it was our organizations that had the resources. The governments were coming to us in order to provide for their own citizens. So all these kind of things are things that were starting to make me think about what I was seeing on the ground and would eventually lead me to come back to work on the PhD. At the same time, in terms of the field of international development and the literature around international development, a lot was going on. There's a lot of conceptions of development. I talked about all those little acronyms in the beginning that are used to measure what development is. One philosophy or way of looking at it that's always guided me is one of Claude Ake, one of the foremost scholars from Nigeria who died untimely in 1997, but was a huge force, a scholar activist that was instrumental in setting up Codesria, which is a social science organization of African scholars working on African issues, producing knowledge on the ground in African countries. One thing he said was the well-being of the people should be the supreme law of development. It's a quote I use a lot because not only because I just like it, but it's like an ethos, like a way to check myself in terms of how I'm looking at issues. It seems like a no-brainer. Yes, the well-being of people should be the supreme law of development. But what he was criticizing was the long history of national level development policies that did not benefit people on the ground, going back to from the initial stages of development, import, substitution, industrialization, export-oriented development, to policies that eventually were about rural destabilization and focusing on the cities, and oh no, that didn't work, so let's try something different. And then eventually, when the economic crises hit and countries were forced to take on structural adjustment programs, like the one in Zimbabwe that I mentioned, structural adjustment became a substitute for a development policy. Structural adjustment, those cutting your spending, gutting your social services, is supposed to be a short-term measure to remedy an economic shock. But for many countries, it became the only development strategy around, and he was critical of that. Other concepts of development started to emerge at the same time. So you had two parallel things going on. You had the movement of structural adjustment and deliberalization and those kind of things happening from the 80s and the 1990s. At the same time, you had scholars like the Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen trying to diagnose what happens when countries experience famine, and a whole different type of concept of development started to emerge that went beyond looking at macro level fiscal indicators to things like entitlements and relative deprivation and vulnerability, social exclusion, adaptive capacity, even sustainable development. There's a story there, though, which I'll mention, and political ecology. So what are all these kinds of terms? What they're getting at is that measuring, understanding well-being, there are some things that that macro level indicators are not going to capture when it comes to development. What Amartya Sen, what his analysis revealed about why countries experience famine, it's not because there's a lack of actual food, but there's the ability of people to exchange whatever resources they have, their strength, their ability to do physical labor, or their social connections, or whatever assets they happen to have, they're not able to exchange them for what they need. So it was a whole, at the time, it was a whole fundamental shift in the way we understand poverty and think about well-being. And other concepts started to emerge based on that looked at what are the social factors that affect people's ability to secure a livelihood in developing countries, especially in situations where most people are not working in formal employment, are not in a job where they exchange their labor for a wage. How else can we understand what's going on the ground? And I put sustainable development there because the whole concept around sustainable development also started to shift. When Our Common Future, when that document was released after the World Conference on Environment and Development, produced that in 1987, and the whole concept of sustainable development became adopted at the international level, poor people in the environment poor people were considered enemies of the environment, I should say. And there was a lot of debate in the literature about how to understand the relationship between poverty and the environment. But eventually an alternative scholarship came out of that did not blame people. It wasn't that people were ignorant or didn't understand their environment in terms of cutting down trees or deforestation, trying to understand environmental change. But what eventually emerged is that most people who live off the land are good stewards of the environment, and when you do see aberrations that cause environmental change, it's usually due to some kind of instability at the international level that it's reverberating down at the local level. Shortages in money and things that are destabilizing local economies that cause people rationally to do things. So expanding the analysis of what's actually going on in developing countries. In September 2000, the world came together in the form of the United Nations and laid out a new agenda for development under the Millennium Development Goals. They agreed to 8 human development goals, reducing by half extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality and empowering women, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV/AIDS, malaria and other diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability, and creating a global partnership for development. Specifically, that was referring to how could the richer countries help the poorer countries in a more sustained and beneficial way. Where I wanted to go, there are two targets. The targets related to water and sanitation come out of Millennium Development Goal 7, ensure environmental sustainability. And so there are two targets that are related to that: reduce by half the number of people who don't have access to improved sources of water, and reduce by half the number of people who don't have access to improved sources of sanitation. There's also a goal under target under Millennium Development Goal 7 about reducing the number of people by half that live in urban slums. Well, what actually is going on? Are we making progress, whether we're talking about the Millennium Development Goals or in our understanding of what does it mean to say developed versus developing? And I wanted to point this out before talking about Nigeria in particular, and the issue of access to water and what was found in the research there, to just put some context on what's actually going on among countries in the developed world. Now, these slides are taken from a great website called gapminder.org. And the founder of Gapminder put up the website to challenge thinking in the international development community and the way we talk about developed versus developing countries. The argument is that we really can't say developed versus developing anymore. Countries are converging. What you see here in the top slide in this here is in 1959, the average income per person was $3,000, and child mortality was 150 per 1,000. And you see in the next slide below that, the developing countries are in the blue bubbles and the industrialized countries are the yellow bubbles. And there's a clear kind of dichotomy between the two countries. But by 2006, you see that more developing countries are starting to, their indicators, their income is going up and their child mortality is going down. And the other thing, if you go to Gapminder, the slides are actually interactive. You see the bubbles move around. You can visualize it better. The other thing that's interesting, what the founder notes, is that developing countries are achieving this without having the same level of income that industrialized countries have, just by making changes in terms of immunization, by being very focused on, in some countries, on providing cleaner water, things like that. You can achieve a lot more than having to wait until you have a level of income like the US or Western Europe to achieve these goals. So when it comes to access to water, which is what I was looking at in Nigeria, the phenomena that you saw in the slide, in the presentation in the beginning, the TED presentation, that's exactly the issue that I'm looking at in Nigeria. What you have is urbanization with limited development. It's a different kind of urbanization that's happening. It's not urbanization driven by, and I'm talking specifically to, with respect to many countries in Southern Africa. If you saw on the previous slide, those countries that are still not quite making that progress, most of those countries are in Africa. But despite that, the lack of economic growth, urbanization is proceeding, and you're seeing the growth of poverty in urban areas. For a long time, poverty was considered to be a rural phenomenon in most developing countries, but now it's clearly becoming an urban phenomenon. Those are more of the indicators just showing that. So water, why water? Those experiences when I was working in Zimbabwe, even though I wasn't working directly on issues related to water, when it came to human rights issues for the minority group, the Tonga people located in West Zimbabwe, one of the key issues was access to water. They weren't provided water under the colonial period, and they weren't provided water during the period of independence by the new government. Some people had to walk 20 miles just to get access to water. Literally 20 miles. People would drink water, but they didn't really use it. In Angola, similarly, the challenge of providing water, small towns that would have to absorb internally displaced people who were displaced by the war already didn't have the infrastructure to sustain their own populations, and fundamental services and infrastructure like water supply, again, were a big challenge. So I always saw it as a cross-cutting issue. Given that Nigeria has the most populous country in Africa, with the latest census has it at 140 million people, and one of the largest cities, second to Cairo, in Lagos, it was a great place to look at some of these issues related to urban growth, where there's limited development and lack of access to basic services. So what are the debates around water? What's that about? There are several conferences in the 1990s, three, in fact, UN conferences around addressing the crisis related to water. Now, you've probably heard statistics about this, and they're citing the statistics that were used to set the Millennium Development Goals. Things like 1 billion people have a lack of access to water, 3 billion have a lack of access to sanitation. And because of this situation, there have been these conferences, but out of these conferences have emerged different debates about how to address the crisis around water supply in developing countries. And these kind of summarize the three main thinking coming out of it. Treating water as a commodity, that comes out of the sustainability literature, so pricing it right so that people don't overuse it. But a lot of people critique that. They're saying that's coming from the industrialized country worldview, but that doesn't apply in countries where they still need to build dams, they still need to build pipes and extend water supply to people versus consumption. But these are things that are discussed. Water is a public good, letting water be provided by the state, providing water publicly versus privately. But again, someone has to fund it. Where does the money come for that from? And then treating water as a human right, which is the approach used in South Africa, where they actually wrote into the Constitution that access to 15 liters of water a day is a fundamental human right. Again, same challenges though. Who is going to provide the water when you have to pay for it? So some of the arguments within these three debates overlap. I just wanted to focus in on talk a little bit more about this idea of urbanization with limited development versus urbanization with development. So we saw that there are many developing countries, especially in Latin America, Asia. The biggest, that everyone talks about are India, China, and Brazil, and that's where you see urbanization with development, where there's growth increases, there's economic growth increase, there's agricultural production increase, there's income increasing, as well as urban employment, and so forth. And the examples are middle-income Asia, the newly industrialized countries in Latin America. Then you see other countries that are experiencing urbanization with limited development, where there's a weak agricultural sector, a lack of intermediate cities and towns, the growth of megacities, and poor economic bases and municipal capacity. And much of sub-Saharan Africa falls into this category. And all of these trends are being reinforced by the phenomenon of globalization, which is increased competition, less domestic protection, and so forth. All of these things are the backdrop for the actual movement of people on the ground. So that brings me to my research on water supply in Nigeria. So it was a two-part thing. I first went to Nigeria in 2005 to look at the history of water supply, interview people, go to the National Archives. I wanted to understand the evolution of infrastructure. I was at first looking at Lagos only, but I extended it to Benin City, which is also in the southwestern part of the country. Out of a few things came out of that. One, I learned that much of the water infrastructure that's in place today in Lagos is essentially the same infrastructure that was in place at the end of the colonial period. And there had been some expansion, but not a lot of expansion done after that. And also similar thing going on in Benin City. So we designed a survey, and then I went back to Nigeria. I worked with the University of Lagos, University of Benin, Pan-African Vision for the Environment, and Koyanum Imala Foundation on the ground, NGOs on the ground, as well as the universities, to carry out this survey. And this is just, the pictures at the top are the survey teams. On the left are Benin City, some of the members of the team in Benin City, and on the right are some of the members from Lagos. And we call the survey Voice for Water. Because amidst all this conversation about these big debates at the international level about how to supply water and these indicators about how we talk about development, and even the idea of reducing by half the lack of access to water, it doesn't get at the reality that access itself is a very complex concept to think about. Access could be shaped, it's not just about how close you are to the source, but how close you are, is it available, does the water flow through pipes, is it adequate, is the quality of water good, is it reliable? How all of those things factor into access, but those aren't things that are easily able to be aggregated at these kind of national levels in the way that things like access are talked about. So before I get into the results, I just want to show the map there is showing Nigeria. In the middle on the left is Edo State, and in the yellow on the top is Benin. On the right is Lagos State, and then the area of Lagos, basically they're both metropolitan areas. So when you talk about Lagos, you're actually talking about an area comprised of 16 local governments. For Benin City, the metropolitan area is 3 local governments. And we surveyed households in 12 neighborhoods in Lagos, 6 neighborhoods in Benin City, so 18 neighborhoods in total, and 783 households to ask them about their access to water, how they define it, and their attitudes about government, and what they've done in relation to their problems with water. So some of the findings that came out of this, what I wanted to point out, one is if you see the graphs on the top, primary and secondary water source, most people don't rely on one source of water. They rely on 2 sources of water, or more, or multiple sources of water. The other thing that came out that we realized is that very few people access public water. Most people are using private sector water, either sold through vendors who deliver water on the street, or from trucks, or bottled water. Problems in terms of the types of problems that people experience with their water supply, the most common problem was unplanned interruptions. And so you see how different infrastructural challenges interlink. So for example, reliable energy supply is a huge challenge in Nigeria. And so when the power goes out, pumps that are pumping people's private water, their borehole systems that pump their own private water supply no longer work. Even the statewide water supply, the pipe network that runs throughout the state, when the energy goes out, so does the water supply. And that's the thing that people complain about the most. In Lagos, people were also having problems with the quality of water supply, and in Benin City, cost was the other big factor. So before I ended today, I wanted to just show some of the images that came out of the study and talk about how people are obtaining water, how people obtain water supply. So in the top left corner, I tend to close with this picture because it was a hopeful one. It was a community we went to in Shomalu local government in Lagos, and you see these are school kids drinking from a public tap. But what's actually going on is that tap is serving a community of about 200 households, and that's the only tap. And the kids coming from school, there's no public water supply in the school. So that when they came, they have their bottles in their bags ready, they're thirsty, and they just swarm on the public tap and drink, but these are some of the challenges. On the right, the small picture on the right is it was my field supervisor in Benin City. The stick, she's pointing a stick into a hole in the ground. That's a public tap that no longer functions. And the picture on the bottom right here, this is a phenomenon that we're seeing where private entrepreneurs will use their own capital and approach the water company to ask if they can lay their own pipes from the mains into their community and then sell water to the community. And then on the left was a billboard showing sachet and bottled water. Other forms of water supply. Every community, almost in every community we went to, there were different ways that people were obtaining water. It wasn't consistent. I mean, it was just so many things going on. So in the top left corner, you see these jerry cans, which are plastic drums used to collect water everywhere throughout Nigeria. This is the water, the pipes that the building is connected to is a completely privately owned company that's supplying water. They've essentially replaced the state in this community in terms of selling water. The other thing is that their water is more expensive. All the vendor water is more expensive than the state, but this water from these kinds of private companies is almost 1,000% more than the state water supply would be. Top right corner, you see a young woman collecting water from a public tap. What the community there that we went to said that they don't like to use the water from the tap because the quality of the water is poor. It's hard to see in the picture, but it was kind of whitish, and it does have a smell. Now, ironically, that's the water treatment, like the chlorine, but because of how the water is treated, you can get clumps of chlorine in the water. It can smell, and people don't trust the piped water. So that's also one of the things that's driving behavior. Bottom left and bottom right is the other phenomena that you're seeing. So when there's a lack of access to water, for example, Lagos, where in a city of nearly 10 million people, only half are even within physical reach of the pipes, people are installing essentially private water systems on their property and then selling the water to their neighbors. Some cases they give water to the neighbors, but it is a large business, and in this case, this is water being sold to the local community. Other things that constrain access to water, when we look at the quality of water, bottom right, you see these are, again, private water pipes that people use their own capital to lay pipes from the mains. They run through gutters. When the pipes break, contaminants enter, it poses a health hazard. The other thing, top left corner, that sign says bathing or washing anything at this borehole is strictly prohibited. So that's a public borehole. So the local government has invested in creating a water supply, but because there's restrictions on how people can use the water, when we went there, people told us they don't use that water supply. They can't because it's too far. You're not going to walk all the way several blocks to collect water there to take back to your house to wash and do things with. So people don't even use it, even though they would be counted as having access to water because they're within physical distance of a borehole, of a water supply. And lastly, this set of images contrasts the public-private water issue. So on the left, you see Singer Water by Bianca Water here. These are two private companies that have just bought these very large water drums and set up shop on a corner. They hire a young man to sell water to the community. The pipe is the state water supply. And PSP stands for private sector participation, which is and that's in Lagos, that's what the government is looking to undertake in order to improve water supply. And you see their website, they're working on improving customer relations, but the reality of what's happening, most of the civil society groups on the ground and NGOs who are part of the National Society of Water and Sanitation, NGOs are very critical of the government's private sector participation plan because they're not talking to people who are already involved in water supply, these informal entrepreneurs or people who are in their own house are selling water. And most of it, they fear, is going to be focused on communities that already have a decent water supply, already have a connection to the pipe, or can afford it. And it's not, the plan is not going to reach the people who are most in need. So these are some of the things that are coming out of it in terms of the research and what we found from the survey, in terms of how people access water and kind of some of the things that influence their behavior, how they use water supply. One of the concepts that I'm looking at in terms of trying to understand behavior is this idea of structural silence. So this is when people are unhappy with their water supply, but they're not able to speak out about it, maybe because they perceive that they're speaking out, that their voice won't be heard, that it'll be a waste of time. We got that a lot when we interviewed people. Or there's social pressure not to speak out for fear of retaliation by authorities or other people who are involved in water supply, even the other private actors. And then people who don't have the ability to switch, either because they can't afford to turn to a private supply, or there are just no alternatives available. So you have a phenomenon. What really struck me coming out of this research is that there are people who are unhappy with their supply. They want to do something about it, but there are these kind of structural barriers in the society preventing them from changing and improving their water supply. So that's kind of where I am now in terms of looking at it and wanting to go further. So I really appreciate your time, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Technical answers to this problem, like new modes of infrastructure or different ways that it might be organized, basically a design question. Like, are there people working on that? And is there communication between this kind of research and that? And then also a sort of historical question. Because basically you're looking at the situation in Lagos, for example, and is there a model for urban infrastructure in that setting? And then I'm thinking of things like Victorian England, where other places have had this issue of how infrastructure migrates to urban scale. Are there ever like cross-cultural historical analysis? So I guess I'm just trying to understand in this sort of development studies, what are the other aspects and how do they communicate? Like, who are your, not your colleagues, but your sort of, what are the other pieces of the chart?
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you. Well, the biggest constraint when it comes to the technical side of this kind of research is the lack of data. What ends up happening, and what I'm hoping to avoid with this, is that you have many one-off kind of studies that get done. So there's a lot of good research out there, but it's usually case study based, or just a researcher like myself collects their own data set, and then it sits, in an enclave somewhere and very difficult to access and communicate with policymakers. From the beginning, I've been, by liaising with NGOs who are part of the National Water and Sanitation Civil Society Network, that's a way that the research can be disseminated to a wider audience. The other thing, being cognizant of the fact that most of the research is case study based, it was important to do a survey so that we could communicate to policymakers to have those numbers. We have 783 households. We can do some kind of analyses to say, definitive, and the way the sampling was done, doing a multi-level cluster sample across the metropolitan area, we can say with it's not perfect because we don't have that kind of ability to actually enumerate every single household and ensure an actually statistically random sample, but we're able to say it's with some confidence that it's representative of what's going on, at least in the local governments where we went to. The Water Corporation, which is the one, both in Nigeria, water tends to be provided by the state. And when I say state, I don't mean government. I mean they're set up like a federal republic, just like the United States. So they have states, And so the Lagos State Water Board is involved with water supply in Lagos. Edo State Water Board is supplying water in Benin City. One criticism of the private sector participation program that they've undertaken in Lagos is that it has not been done in consultation with communities. There hasn't been this kind of surveying the population. See, it's just, again, they actually got a World Bank loan to carry out the privatization. That was the impetus to turn the state water company into a private entity to receive this money from the World Bank and then to proceed with the plans. But the hope is that because there's survey data, there's some numbers, it can speak to policymakers and point in that direction. But not a lot of, from what we see, not a lot of research coming from the state that's collecting data on people's behavior. So we're trying to influence the way decisions are made. As far as the model of urban infrastructure, the way water is provided is actually, a lot of it is the way it's always been provided, even during the colonial period. So wells are big, and even the presence of vendors was very much present in, even during the colonial period, in terms of how people obtain water. So you're kind of seeing the similar ways, just like markets still exist, these big outdoor markets where people buy most of their groceries and things like that. You're seeing a lot of structures that have always been in place, essentially still in operation, just on a larger scale in cities. I'm not sure if that answers.
Which I found helpful to understand your approach was that you have doubts about the policy solutions that can come at the macro level, and therefore your approach had to be to understand better what's going on at the town level.
Yeah.
So as the research has developed, has that led you to a place at which you've begun to see the connection between policies towards solutions? Or, and then this goes back to part of your opening, are you concerned about the questions of corruption, or are they relatively insignificant toward trying to achieve solutions?
That's a good question. Well, corruption is not insignificant, but I just didn't want to focus there like as if that was the only thing going on. It's certainly an issue. I think what's come out of this is, and that's where I was talking about the structural silence, that there's a vacuum between policymakers and between people who would otherwise speak out about certain things. Some people do have access to the government and are able to get, they call them big men in Nigeria. Big men, big women tend to be the more, people who have money and influence in the society can get things done on a very, for their neighborhood or something like that. But for the average person, there's a gap between being able to influence the government and the government being able to hear and respond to what people want. Part of that is the issue, Nigeria is no stranger to electoral corruption, although with the advent of electoral democracy in 1999, people complain, but things are better than when it was the military dictatorship and there was no access at all. So, there's some improvement, but there is this space that there's no bridge between the average person and policymakers, and that's the area where we have to look at, and that's what I meant by going beyond. It's just poverty, or it's just there's some structural issues with governance that we have to look at. Thank you for your question. Well, the examples you were citing were coming from a couple of different experiences. The situation where NGOs were almost replacing the government was in Angola, which was in a war situation. That said, NGOs do have a huge, a larger role than what we would expect nonprofits to have, say, here in the U.S. They do play a larger role, even in terms of service delivery or in providing this kind of public check on government. And in Nigeria, that's been relatively new because of the history of military rule. In terms of, from a positive or a normative perspective rather, what the role of NGOs should be, I can say within the development community, there's been a recognition that in order to be sustainable in terms of how aid is provided, it has to be, we have to strengthen governments. And so there's actually been a shift in how aid is provided, to provide it directly to governments and have NGOs play more of an assisting role. Before, it was like avoid the government because of corruption, because of problems, and give the money to NGOs. But that's, in the long-term sense, is not a sustainable way to do things. And so in the long term, the NGOs can play a normative role, can be can be that civil society that provides a voice and a public eye that scrutinizes what government does. But until we get there, they will still be involved in service delivery. But where we want to get to is a stronger and more accountable government that is providing services, I think.